Very pleased to see such a great turnout. Don't know which time zone most people are in, but I'm in Geneva, so it's evening for me, and I hope many of you are already past a working day as well, winding off in a discussion about nuclear weapons. Very great to see so many familiar names, but for those who I don't know or who maybe don't know me, just a brief introduction. My name is Florian. I work with the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN. I'm based in Geneva, and we're hosting this webinar together with IPPNW, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Very pleased to, in a minute, introduce our lineup of keynote speakers for this event. But I just gonna have to say a few housekeeping rules. The first one is that this is a recorded webinar, as you have probably already seen. So there will be a recording of this that will be published. If you therefore don't want your name out there or even your face, just turn your camera off. And I would also be very glad if people can keep their microphones closed, just so there's no disturbance, and we can go on smoothly. We proceed by having three keynote speakers from academic background, from diplomatic background, and from a parliamentary background, and then four presentations of campaigning efforts in different European countries to push back against the normalization of nuclear weapons as means of security. Following that, there'll be time left for questions. We'd be very keen to discuss this in more detail, answer any questions you might have. As I'm sure you've done in the past, to ask the question, either you can put them in the chat, or I think that's the nicer way to do it. Just raise your hand, and we'll call you for a genuine interaction, albeit digital. I think that's all I need to say in terms of housekeeping, and even more people have joined in the meantime, which is fantastic. Welcome, everyone, and I think we can get started without further ado. Very pleased to introduce the first speaker. Sterre van Buuren is a researcher on nuclear weapons. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Glasgow, where she studies the participation of private actors in nuclear weapons politics in France and the UK. She's also affiliated with the infamous Nuclear Knowledges program at Sciences Po in Paris. And she's a Dutch national, so very familiar with the political context that most of us also found ourselves in, and has previously published on the tension between nuclear weapons and democracy, and mapped how nuclear risks interact with other things such as climate change. Sterre, I'm going to give you the floor, and Molly for the presentation.
Perfect. I actually think I can do my own presentation, which... One second, as always. I'm less competent with it than you would assume. But anyway, besides this impression, thanks, Florian, for the introduction. The presentation I want to give today is sort of broadly about a lot of the European nuclear issues that I think are happening, and that sort of connect to my research. I will be forcing a climate angle into it out of just passion. Does the presentation work? Great. Okay.
Now, there we go.
So, the question that I've come up with is a very broad questioning nuclear deterrence in Europe. Unfortunately, there's been a lot in the news about what deterrence could be in Europe and all the moves we should be making to keep ourselves safe in an increasingly nuclearized world. I think we can all agree that that's taken off in the past year. It's been happening before. I think since the Ukraine war, there have just been more conversations about Europe's security environment and maybe the role nuclear weapons can play in keeping us safer from it. But in the past year, with the second Trump administration, you've seen a lot of this logic of, well, Europe has to step up, stand on its own two legs in nuclear issues. And To be fair, we've always been a pretty nuclear continent. We have 2 nuclear weapon states. We have 5 states that have nuclear weapons on their territory. We have 30 states that are in some way under a nuclear umbrella. 31 if you count Belarus, I guess. And over the past year, the 2 nuclear weapon states have both announced pretty big expansions in both the forces that they'll have and the role they want those forces to play. In March 2025, France announces it's going to roughly double its nuclear air force and add the base to it. The UK then announces a couple months later that it is going to start having airplanes with a nuclear role again for the first time since basically the end of the Cold War. And the thing that I think triggered this whole meeting and the new conversations is obviously this month, France makes a fairly monumental move of expanding its warhead stockpile and agreeing in some way to start collaborating with European countries on nuclear deterrence. It's not super clear what that means. It never will be very clear what that means. But the idea is that France is going to start working with the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Poland, Denmark, Sweden, and Greece so far to provide a nuclear umbrella. Now, I think we all have a sort of intuitive understanding of why that's happening. Europe feels unsafe, and the idea is if we feel unsafe, we should try to develop our capacities to make ourselves safer. And I think the conversation I want to have today is about whether or not this is an effective way to keep us safe. I think there's lots of good arguments against nukes from moral perspectives, from sort of consequentialist perspectives. There's a lot of good reasons to not be a fan of the weapons, but I think there's a strategic intuition that a lot of people have that, yeah, but it's going to fix it. We have problems and they're going to be fixed if we just have more nukes. So maybe ignore all those concerns and let's be realistic. And I want to engage this on their own grounds, on the logic that, hey, maybe getting more nukes isn't actually going to make us more secure. Because to make Europe secure, sure, you have to do something against the threat on the eastern border. You have to do at least 2 other things if we want to get out of this century alive. You have to not all die in a nuclear war, and we have to not all die in some sort of climate change related disaster. You can pretty convincingly make an argument that more nukes are bad, or are bad for the latter 2 and maybe not ideal for the first. I'm mainly going to be focusing today, just because of time constraints, on why I think nuclear deterrence isn't as effective a strategy for countering Russia as it's vaguely made out to be. But we'll very briefly touch on the sort of other sides of nuclear and climate risks. But let's start here. Is nuclear deterrence the best response we have available to Russia? I think I have 3 basic lines of objection or discussion to that correspond to sort of presumptions I have the feeling that are in the arguments government are making, but that aren't super often articulated. The first is, well, we want nukes because Russia has them, and we have to protect ourselves. B is, well, yeah, but if we have nukes, no one's going to attack us. And C is, well, we have to have nukes because there's no other way of doing it. I have quibbles with each of those points. Point number 1, we need nukes to protect ourselves. It's a really fun sentence where the verb is completely wrong, because nukes can't actually protect us from anything. If Russia has nukes and it decides to launch them at Europe, it doesn't matter if we have 0 or 10,000, they're going to hit just as much. Ever since we've invented ballistic missiles around the 1960s, we haven't had a reliable way of preventing an incoming nuclear strike from hitting our cities. So the only thing that having nukes is going to let us do is take some revenge, which in terms of like physical security for Europe makes it worse. Because if we strike Russian cities, that's going to release more fallout, that's going to release more ash into the atmosphere, which is going to worsen the nuclear winter effects and the famines that are likely to follow from it. So no, it doesn't protect us. Point 2. Yeah, but if we have nukes, no one's going to attack us. A slightly more true sentence, but still a more questionable sentence than it gets made out to be. Because first off, nuclear deterrence isn't like an inherently magically effective thing. There have been attacks on nuclear armed states. Iran is currently lobbing missiles at Israel. I live in the UK. One of my best friends is Argentinian. One of the references I make a lot is that the Falklands War can happen when the UK has nukes and Argentina does not. So there isn't a magic to if you have nuclear weapons, no one's going to attack you. People have to sort of believe whatever threat you're making. They have to be scared enough of your nuclear retaliation that they don't invade. This is particularly hard to make credible because of the lack of defense against nukes I just mentioned. If you start a nuclear war, you can't win it because you don't have a way of stopping an incoming attack. It's always semi-suicidal to start a nuclear strike on any other country that has a nuclear weapon or a large enough nuclear arsenal. And it's especially kind of weird to do that suicidal move on behalf of another country, which is where we run into the specifically European problem of France is promising, not just that if Russia attacks France, it's going to escalate to sort of mutual suicide. But if Russia attacks Estonia, then France is going to be willing to bear the cost of that by having Paris laid to waste. That's already kind of questionable now because, I mean, last year they held up an EU-UK defense pact over fishing rights. So I'm not entirely sure I'm convinced that they're gonna like accept Marseille being destroyed now, let alone after the 2027 elections. Which I'm not optimistic about personally. And then basically number 3, well, yeah, but we have no other way of doing this. This is all we got. I think there's a real European underestimation of the armies we already have available. Sure, we were not the most militarized continent, thank God, but we're up there. If you look at the conventional balance of forces between Russia and Europe, it's not totally disfavorable to Europe. We have a population of 500-ish million. They have a population of 150 million. We have an economy that's just in every measurable sense better than theirs. Specifically militarily, European capabilities in cyberspace, in air, in space, in naval domain, all exceed those of Russia, and in land, it's really just dependent on whether or not we can get munitions back on track. I'm not saying that like we would crush Russia in a war. It's just we're fairly evenly matched. There's definitely a rational Russian president wouldn't start a war against Europe because it's going to be disastrous. The best case scenario is we all end up sort of like the post-World War I nuclear states, just nursing our wounds. A rational Russian leader wouldn't do that. So maybe the argument then be, well, then we need nuclear weapons to deal with an irrational Russian president, which I find is a fairly concerning gap we're filling. Either we believe that deterrence works because the people on both sides are rational, in which case, if you make a sort of balance of forces reasoning, rational people should agree not to have a war in Europe, or you agree people aren't rational, and then you probably shouldn't be betting on an apocalyptic strategy to keep your continent safe. I haven't been paying attention to time, by the way, so if someone needs to flag me down, please do. But the great thing about trying to imagine other ways of keeping Europe safe is that if you ask Europeans, they actually kind of agree with the path I've suggested might exist. We did surveys in 2019 and 2024 with the infamous Nuclear Knowledges Research Group. We had IFOP poll people in 9 European countries, asked them what should non-nuclear weapon states do to keep themselves safe, to keep themselves protected. We gave them 6 options, allowed them to pick 3 of those maximum. Some people picked 1 or 2 instead. So those options were really quickly, essentially, a nuclear umbrella, like a nuclear alliance with, at the time, US seemed more plausible. Nuclear proliferation, so developing your own nuclear weapon, getting security guarantees that your country would not be attacked with a nuclear weapon, advocating for nuclear abolition, investing in conventional arsenals in your own country, and then establishing or improving your conventional alliances. There's a slight shift in attitude. Nuclear weapons definitely become a little more popular with the Ukraine war, and abolition becomes less popular. But overall, the pattern remains very clear. by far, the two nuclear options are the less popular ones. But like, I don't know, it depends how you measure, but by several percentage points, even at the lowest rate. And that's true across countries, except I think maybe Poland after Ukraine, but I can double check that. Now, to me, this makes a lot of sense because to return to my kind of framework, you have a solution to a security problem that maybe works, but maybe isn't optimal, that at least fills at best kind of a very narrow gap in facing Russia. And that risks two other major security goals that you should want to pursue if you want to make it out of the 21st century. Nuclear weapons make nuclear war more likely. That feels like a very chicken and egg point, in a way, but putting more nuclear weapons in Europe means there's more risk of those weapons going off. That can happen both because there's just more tension, there's more crises in which we sort of gesture at our nuclear weapons and then maybe feel compelled to start using them. There's more room for misinterpretation, for miscalculation. There's also just more sort of physical systems that can fail, which can produce accidents or they can produce some sort of nuclear disaster in another way. Specifically, also in the sort of Macron plan, he at some point suggests that they should spread French nuclear weapons around Europe in an archipel of power. That would be like an archipelago of targets. Every time you put a nuclear weapon in a base in your country, that becomes more likely that your specific country gets hit in the first wave of nuclear attacks. Point two, militarization is a terrible idea in a context where we're all already facing devastating consequences from climate change. It's at least two pathways in which we endanger our future by investing too much in nuclear arsenals. The first is simple resource diversion. By ICAN's estimate, in 2024, the nuclear state spent about 100 billion on nuclear weapons. By our rough estimate that we haven't published yet and will need to get peer reviewed, we think about 31 of those annually through 2032 are just for modernization and for arms racing. Those aren't, if you want to keep the same arsenals, you could cut that, still lose it. So the fact that so much of it is going to arms racing suggests we're going to keep escalating those costs upward as we race further. And currently within Europe, our accelerated weapons production is already putting our climate targets at risk. Weapons production is very carbon intensive, it's very polluting, it's one of the less regulated industries, and we are currently throwing our climate targets out the window to meet the military's goals. So with all that in mind, I suppose my argument is this. European security is both more complex and sort of more simple than we make it out to be. Strictly speaking, nuclear deterrence, we're not sure if it works or how well it works against one goal, and we know it's bad for two others. If we want our policy world to be prepared for that, we needed to have a transparent debate about alternatives, and we needed to take into account the climate and risk context in which we operate. I very selfishly put a paper I wrote about that on the slide, but I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A as well.
Thank you so much, Sterre. This is a fascinating start. Thanks so much for grounding us in this, security policy or defense policy debate that we're seeing, and bring some really solid arguments against some of the trends. And of course, for pointing us to research that answers some of these questions quite directly in a way that's pretty hard to attack than maybe more political arguments. Now, next, I would like to turn to the perspective of a non-nuclear weapon state, a non-nuclear state, as the constitution of his country actually phrases it. Ambassador Thomas Hajnoczi was the head of the director for disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation at the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In that capacity, he led the delegation of Austria during the TPNW negotiations. He previously also worked as security policy director in the ministry, and currently works as an advisor for Mayors for Peace. I think many of you have met Thomas at the various conferences or webinars in the past. So Thomas brings the perspective of a country that decided a long time ago to develop its security policy without nuclear weapons, not based on the threat on using nuclear weapons. And this is also a voice that maybe in the current debate doesn't get the attention it actually deserves, but that could be very crucial to finding a solution that doesn't rest on nuclearization of more nuclearization in Europe. Thomas, over to you.
Thank you so much, Florian, and hello to everyone wherever you are. I also see quite a number of very familiar, nice faces. And of course, I'm very delighted that there's so many new people that I haven't met yet. I think Sterre has done an extremely good introduction into the subject. You underlined, Florian, so Austria is a little bit special, and you asked already various times at other occasions why. I mean, it's pretty simple because during the Cold War, Austria, being situated in the center of Europe, was not in any alliance, but it was quite clear for geographical reasons that if there would be a major military East-West confrontation, it would be very useful to get into Austria. So the archives are today open. We know that the Soviet Union had planned to drop a nuclear bomb over Tyrol so that NATO couldn't have this northeast passage between Germany and Italy. And the Americans, they wanted to stop the Soviet tanks right at our border. They would have dropped at the Hungarian border a nuclear bomb. And that's only 40 kilometers from the second largest city of Austria, which would have been certainly affected. So I think Austrians learned very early that their role in a nuclear war would be battlefield and the role of a victim. So as you have mentioned already in 1999, the Austrian constitution was amended, and since that time, nuclear weapons are prohibited in Austria, and it's prohibited to participate in all activities in favor of them. That, by the way, made it very easy for us to be active in bringing about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, because we had it already at home for quite a number of years. But even today, nuclear bombs are stationed just 60 kilometers from the Austrian border. Sterre showed the map. That's Aviano in northern Italy. And certainly we know there are studies in case they would be bombed and nuclear stuff would get out in the atmosphere. Again, Austria could be affected by that. What really has changed since that time is that today we know about the grave, catastrophic, and complex humanitarian consequences of nuclear warfare. And just think of nuclear winter. And they are global. And there are about 150 states, so it's 3/4 of the international community, including Austria, that have forsworn nuclear weapons, would end up as collateral damage of a nuclear conflict. These states definitely have an interest and a voice in the discussions on nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. And as we know, nuclear deterrence is always used as a way to justify the continued existence of nuclear weapons. Without nuclear weapons, you cannot have nuclear deterrence. So if you believe in it, you have to opt for it, that you will have them also in the future. So we cannot make progress towards a safer world without nuclear weapons when we want to keep them. And so that makes it quite difficult for a number of states to to profess that they are in favor of nuclear disarmament, and at the same time they cling to nuclear weapons, or as they feel, protection by them. So from the Austrian perspective, it's very clear, and the Austrian foreign minister said it already various times at the UN General Assembly. We see nuclear weapons as a threat to our security. And responding to this threat by seeking to remove it is thus a prime responsibility and legitimate concern for all governments. And that was a citation from a paper on the legitimate security concerns of states parties of the TPNW, which was tabled by Austria a year ago at the meeting of states parties of the TPNW in New York. And that was quite an interesting exercise, because it wasn't something that the Austrians just wrote. There was a process of discussions among the TPNW states parties, how they perceive their security concerns. And of course, there was a lot of common denominators, so that made it not too difficult to put this then down to paper. And I think it was perhaps for the first time that we had a structured way to encompass our common view, because usually the discussions in the media just focus on the positions of nuclear weapon states, or bigger European states that are under nuclear umbrella. So at the time of heightened political tensions, and the war being fought in Europe already for more than 4 years, it's obvious that many long for protection on our continent. And this old belief by nuclear weapon states and nuclear-dependent states that nuclear deterrence provides security and will continue to do so in the foreseeable future has made a comeback. While the idea of a kind of umbrella in an inclement international climate might appear appealing, the reality is not so simple. The current Eurobomb debate has been triggered by doubts whether the present US administration would be willing to use nuclear weapons to defend a European ally, and thereby put the lives of tens of millions of US citizens at risk by counterstrike. And I think Sterre has elaborated this very clearly, and it's really not a new issue. It was always there 60 years ago in Germany. People doubted whether the US would dive for Berlin. And Kissinger has put it very poignantly. He said, great powers do not commit suicide for their allies. And this fundamental uncertainty of a nuclear umbrella will always exist, regardless whether we consider a US, a British, or a French nuclear umbrella. And we have also to take into account that nuclear deterrence is a theory developed around 1960 in a bipolar world. In today's multipolar world, a zero-sum game approach has become inadequate. Its inherent risks are getting more and more pronounced by geopolitical tensions, new and disruptive technologies, proliferation pressures, and the weakening of the legal and normative framework for nuclear weapons. The question is not whether nuclear deterrence can help to prevent nuclear attacks and other related threats, which it might it may do to a certain degree. But the real problem is that nuclear deterrence will not always prevent nuclear war, because it requires a certain behavior of an opponent that we cannot take for granted. In short, nuclear deterrence presupposes rational behavior by rational leaders. I don't think it's a given in today's world that all leaders act just rationally, plus a credible threat potential. And credible means that the defending state possesses both the military capabilities to inflict disastrous damage on an attacking state, and the attacking state believes also in the resolve of the attacked states to use them. So when the state is not ready to use nuclear weapons with all their grave effects, the nuclear deterrence cannot work. So there's no way we just have nuclear weapons to deter, because as long as you are not really willing to use them, how should they deter? And here we are at the core of the weakness of the nuclear deterrence theory. When you know that your opponent could destroy vast parts of your country, any use of nuclear weapons would be irrational, as it might be suicidal. So the threat with nuclear weapons is not logical and therefore not credible. This self-contradiction, however, might induce less risk-averse decision makers to use nuclear weapons in spite of a military doctrine of its opponent based on nuclear deterrence. A gamble with our lives. As General Lee Butler, who was the former commander-in-chief of the US Strategic Command, has said, nuclear deterrence flies in the face of the most vital goal of national security, to ensure the survival of the nation. Since the theory of nuclear deterrence was proposed in the 60s, science has progressed. The huge dimensions in space and time of the immediate humanitarian emergency created by nuclear weapons use have been researched. We know today also much more about the mid and longer term atmospheric, climate, and food security consequences of even limited nuclear war. And we know that they would be global and might even end our civilization. The notion of credible nuclear first strike and counter-strike capabilities becomes largely irrelevant in such a context. Winning a nuclear conflict in the classical understanding of victory in a military conflict is an impossibility. Nuclear deterrence is a high-risk approach to international security. Ambiguities and risk-taking are woven into the very fabric of nuclear deterrence. Consequently, there is no and never can be any assurance that nuclear deterrence will hold in any crisis situation. And it's quite interesting. I have discussed various times with nuclear weapon diplomats from nuclear weapon states. That's undisputed. They don't think that nuclear deterrence will always work. It's clear to everyone that it can work various times and so on, but there's no guarantee, and it might come the day when it doesn't work. So it's a fragile and precarious psychological construct. Miscalculations, misinformation, human and technical errors are also always possible. The uncertain stability and security benefits of nuclear deterrence need to be weighed against the risks inherent in this theory and against the increasing body of scientific evidence of the catastrophic global impact that deterrence failure and nuclear weapons use would have. The security approach creates acute threats and risk for the entire international community. So summing up, nuclear deterrence continually threatens to bring about the very act it was designed to suppress. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, for this sobering analysis. Very, very nice to hear this in such a concise way. Now, from sort of the academic perspective to the governmental perspective, I would now like to turn to the parliamentary perspective. I'm very pleased that Oras Tynkkynen, Member of Parliament from Finland, has joined us. He's been in the Finnish parliament since 2004 until 2015, and then again since 2023, and currently is the leader or the chair of the parliamentary group of the Finnish Green Party in the parliament. As some of you might have seen, the Finnish government has proposed a new law that would end the ban of stationing nuclear weapons on Finnish territory. So there's lots to talk about nuclear weapons in Finland. And without further ado, I'm heading over the microphone to Oras.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I am indeed a Green Member of Parliament and the group leader for our parliamentary group. What I'm not, however, is a foreign and security policy expert. We have many of those in our party, but I'm not one of them. So what I will try to do is to perhaps provide an overview of the Finnish debate on nuclear weapons as it stands today. I might not be able to quite deliver on the promise of the title I was given on the agenda, but hopefully this update will be useful and informative as well. I should also at the outset say that some of the information we as members of parliament get regarding nuclear weapons and the policy in Finland is classified. And of course, I cannot refer to that here, but hopefully provide something useful nevertheless. Now, I don't know how many of you are very familiar with the Finnish political context, so I thought I could perhaps start with providing a bit of a backdrop to what is happening today. The first one being that historically Finland used to be for a very long time militarily non-aligned for perhaps quite understandable geopolitical and historical reasons. There has also been a very long-standing culture of consensus when it comes to foreign and security policy issues in Finland, the idea being that for a small country like Finland, we need to stick together and we need to have unified positions on matters of great importance. And there has also been a very long-standing consensus politically in Finland against nuclear weapons and allowing them on Finnish territory. Now, a major shift happened, unsurprisingly, in 2022 after Putin launched his illegal war of aggression in Ukraine. And not quite literally overnight, but in a very short span of time, the mood shifted significantly in Finland, leading to a NATO accession, which was actually very widely supported both by policymakers as well as the Finnish population at large. At the time of the discussion on NATO accession, there was a widely shared understanding that Finland would not need to change its legislation when it comes to nuclear weapons. We have actually two different laws outlawing nuclear weapons on Finnish territory. One, perhaps surprisingly, the nuclear energy law, and the second one, the criminal code. And at the time of the NATO accession debate in Finland, the understanding was that there would be no need to change those laws and the bans could remain in place in Finnish legislation. Also, perhaps politically relevant in terms of background is that the current government ruling Finland is a hard right coalition government that covers both a more traditional center-right or two parties in the center-right as well as more extreme hard-right party. And that, I think, is sometimes reflected on some of the decisions they are making on foreign and security policy as well. And my final point in regard of the background is that our current president, Mr. Alexander Stubb, has coined this term for Finnish foreign and security policy, which is values-based realism. And many critics, including myself, would argue that so far what we have seen of this values-based realism has been very heavy on the realism and very light on the values. Now, moving on to the recent government proposal. The government just a couple of weeks ago released a proposal that would remove the legal limitations on nuclear weapons on Finnish territory if the use of or the presence of nuclear weapons meets one of three criteria. One is Finnish military defense, the second is joint NATO defense, and the third is defense cooperation, presumably outside of the NATO context. And the justification for this proposal by the government is to strengthen Finland's and NATO's, or more specifically NATO's nuclear deterrent, and to remove all obstacles or limitations on that deterrent. And the government has also argued that by the time of NATO accession, as we were not full NATO members, we did not have the information relevant to come to this conclusion. In other words, at the time, people believed that there would be no need to remove these bans from legislation. Now, having been a full NATO member, this understanding, or so the government argues, has changed. And now with the information we have as a full NATO member, these changes would be necessary. One, I think, perhaps idiosyncratic part of the Finnish debate, possibly recognizable by our Nordic friends, is that a surprisingly large amount of time and energy has been spent on whether the current legislation with limitations to nuclear weapons in laws or the government proposal to remove those limitations is the Nordic way of dealing with nuclear weapons, and at times the debate has been quite confusing. The government has argued that they do not intend to have or place nuclear weapons on Finnish territory. There would be no intention to have bases with nuclear weapons also in the future, nor having planes transport nuclear weapons during military exercises. Just one note on the process. I earlier said that there has been this long-standing tradition in Finland to try to come up with consensus on key foreign and security policy decisions. This was clearly not followed in this case. The government put out its own proposal without consulting other parties, let alone having a proper process for bringing everyone on board and coming up with joint shared conclusions. Now, the reactions to this government proposal have been, of course, as one might expect in a democracy, different, but a sentiment quite widely shared has been a sense of surprise because many people did not expect this to happen, and to some extent also shock because as everyone here probably understands, nuclear weapons are not just any kind of weapons, and they do have a very specific role, both in terms of defense as well as on a more principled level. The process with which the government has come up with this proposal has been widely rejected, not only by opposition parties, but also by some people from the government ranks, as well as independent experts and commentators. The substance of the proposal, i.e. removing legal limitations on nuclear weapons on Finnish territory, has been opposed by three opposition parties, that is the Social Democrats, us, the Greens, as well as the left. The Centre Party, which is the fourth bigger opposition party, leans towards supporting the government proposal, and not surprisingly, the four government parties support this proposal by their own government. Polling suggests that a clear majority of the Finnish people is still against nuclear weapons on Finnish territory. Of course, some of that may depend on how the question is phrased, but nevertheless, I think this reflects the mood among the Finnish people. Now, the understanding is that the proposal does not require a constitutional process, which means that the government parties can pass the law in the parliament with simple majority, which they have. So the proposal will pass. Currently, the proposal is out for comment, so any stakeholders and experts can provide their views on the proposal. It would be highly unlikely that the proposal will change significantly based on this process. Also, the time for providing comments has been cut short from what is recommended for normal laws, let alone laws of this importance and magnitude. The government has come up with a kind of a fig leaf to perhaps appease some of the critics. They do not intend to change the proposal and back down from their idea of removing legal obstacles to nuclear weapons on Finnish territory. However, what they are proposing is that the parties agree on a statement, political statement, to be included in the government report on foreign and security policy. And this would then present the Finnish national approach to nuclear weapons and also to some extent limit what and how nuclear weapons could be in the Finnish territory. Now, we in the Greens and in the two other opposition parties that oppose this government proposal do not consider this to be adequate at all, and we of course want the limitations to stay in the laws. Now, in the interest of time, I would stop here, but I would be happy to take questions and comments later on.
Thank you so much, Horace. I learned a lot about Finnish internal politics, and as always, we always have to see foreign policy decisions, of course, also from a domestic policy lens. Thank you so much for this introduction in the debate, and just to put on the record, all the best for the fight against this. And let us know how we can support you even from outside Finland, of course. Now, with these three keynote speeches, I want to segue to 4 short interventions from campaigns in different European countries, starting with Belgium, then followed by France, Spain, and Sweden, where the discussion that we try to represent in these 3 speakers is very active, but so is the civil society pushback against government proposals to increase the reliance on nuclear weapons. So I'm handing over the microphone to Naomi Zoka, who works for Pax Christi in Flanders, the northern part of Belgium, lobbying the government to join the TPNW to remove nuclear weapons from Belgian soil, and where there's now a new resolution in the parliament to join this treaty. Naomi, over to you.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, Florian. I'll first start by explaining a little bit what we are struggling with right now in Belgium and what we are exactly fighting against right now. So we have observed quite some backsliding in Belgium's attitude towards nuclear weapons in the past few years, especially since the new government came into power. The previous government, which was under Alexander De Croo, made quite an effort to engage with civil society and even made sure that Belgium attended the meeting of state parties on the TPNW every year. And it was also explicitly mentioned in the government agreement that though Belgium was not part of the treaty, that they did acknowledge it could be beneficial in disarmament efforts. Now things have changed quite a bit. With the new government, civil society has had a lot more efforts getting into contact with policymakers when it comes to treaties such as the TPNW, or even the NPT or new resolutions. The government has also stopped observing the meeting of state parties and removed it completely from the government agreement. Last year, obviously, the alarm bell started ringing a little bit more when our Prime Minister Bart de Wever said in an interview that Europe should probably start looking at a European nuclear deterrent. And now, a year later, he speaks with a lot of enthusiasm about the possibility of Belgium collaborating with France on this this European nuclear deterrent, or the Eurobomb, as we all like to call it. We have addressed the Ministry of Foreign Affairs about this a few weeks ago, about our concerns right now, how the government is acting in these new developments and the need for disarmament. And they still had quite the cheek to say that Belgium is still committed to the 3 pillars of the Non-Proliferation Agreement. As we all know, disarmament, non-proliferation, and safe use of nuclear energy. But by cheering on France's quest for nuclear expansion and possibly collaborating, they are making quite a bigger mockery out of the NPT than they have already done in the past. 2 of those 3 pillars, which are non-proliferation and disarmament. So it is impossible to take on this stance and tell us that you are still committed to disarmament while letting our prime minister run with these exclamations. Also, financial institutions in Belgium have been backsliding when it comes to disarmament. The biggest banks, national banks here like KBC and Belfius, have reopened the door for nuclear investments. In 2018, Pax Christi worked very hard and succeeded at getting them to pull out their investments. Now, a few years later, those efforts are being overturned. A lot of progress was made by civil society and the peace movements here, but they are slowly being chipped away bit by bit under this new government and these new nuclear ambitions from Europe. And on top of that, several peace organizations have also lost government funding last year and will most likely not be able to work anymore in the next few years. Right now, what we are trying to do in this context is remediate all those things that I just mentioned. Since Macron's announcement, we have been in contact with our parliamentarians and urging them to perform their parliamentary duties. Back in 1963, nuclear weapons were placed here against anyone's will without parliamentary debate, let alone public debate. And we are trying to remind them that this mistake that happened in the past cannot happen again because we are still a democracy. Though those nuclear weapons probably won't be here tomorrow, it is still our duty to act as fast as possible. We have also started conversations with banks again to remind them that nuclear weapons are still weapons of mass destruction, and that financing them is basically financing world annihilation. We are trying to obviously educate the population about the risks of militarization, armament, particularly nuclear armament, and the dissolvement of civil society, because all these things tie in with each other when it comes to the problems we are facing today. And even though there is a lot of pushback, as I've mentioned just right now, I think that now is exactly the time for us to be loud, to be very vocal, if not obnoxious, when it comes to these issues and really letting the people understand the threats that we are facing right now. And what is still here of civil society is really joining hands right now and joining forces and thinking of everything we can do to counter everything that has been discussed, not only on this call, but also the past few weeks. So that was for Belgium. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. Much appreciated your insight. Next, I would like to go to France. Hand over the microphone to Jean-Marie Collin, Director of ICAN France.
Hi, thank you for the invitations. Well, I will mainly present President Macron's speech. However, I would like to briefly note that there should be a positive development in the coming months regarding the law on victims of the French nuclear explosions. And this is an important and positive step to which our campaign has contributed over the past several months. So for several months, France has signaled its intention to develop political and military agreements with a number of European states, with the aim of asserting its role as a military power on the continent. President Macron's speech on March 2, announcing a path toward what he calls advanced deterrence, doesn't represent a recent shift. It is part of a strategy initiated at the very beginning of his first term, encouraging European states to adopt France's strategic cultures, in reality the cultures of nuclear deterrence. This ambition was already clearly expressed in his Sorbonne speech in September 2017. In 2020, he called for the development of a strategic dialogue with European partners on the role of nuclear deterrence in collective security. So Russian invasion of Ukraine, followed by Donald Trump's returns, have just acted as accelerators. The March 2 speech thus appears as the result of nearly a decade of political groundwork supported by think tanks as well as the French Ministry of Defense and Foreign Affairs. Before analyzing its contents, one observation stands out. The French media receptions of this speech was marked by a striking lack of critical scrutiny, particularly regarding its legal and security implications, especially in relation to the NPT. The situation is, for me, a reminiscence of Albert Camus' text published on August 8, 1945. Camus said, "The world is what it is, which is to say not much." And so it was a response to the media following Hiroshima. And similarly, Macron's speech have been widely relayed without meaningful examinations of its consequences. Camus continued to say that any average size stones can now be completely leveled by a bomb the size of a football. And the President Macron's words echo this when he stated that a single French submarine carried a strike capability equivalent to all the bombs dropped in Europe during the Second World War, adding that this represents nearly 1,000 times the power of the first nuclear bombs. And the language itself has also evolved. It's no longer about an acceptable damage, but about France's ability to inflict damage from which a state could not recover. Substantively, several announcements deserve close attention. The President first stated that a strengthening of our arsenal is essential. France already possesses 300 nuclear warheads. What could not already be destroyed with such an arsenal that would justify increasing it further? In practice, this would involve doubling the airborne nuclear force by 2035, so 4 squadrons, and increasing the number of warheads per missile, so potentially from 6 to 10. At the same time, he insists that this is not about entering in an arms race. This claim raises questions. An arms race is not defined by matching other arsenals in size, but by a dynamic of increasing capabilities in response to perceived threats. In that sense, any increase contributes to such a dynamic. The central point, however, is the advanced nuclear deterrence. Behind this concept lies a gradual Europeanization of France's nuclear doctrine. In practical terms, countries such as Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, Poland, Sweden, Greece, and Denmark, for the moment, would be encouraged to politically support this approach and participate in exercises related to the French nuclear deterrence. So these countries are going to spend money for that exercise. There will be no deployment of nuclear weapons similar to NATO arrangement currently planned, but in the medium term, it could be a possibility. These cooperations operate on several levels. France has already established a working group with Germany and intends to multiply such groups with other states. This fragmented approach raises questions. It doesn't appear to be the most effective way to building lasting the trust. Another consequence is political. It will become more and more difficult for these states, as they had done it, to participate as observers at the meetings of the TPNW. And such developments are likely to be perceived by many states as contradicting France's commitments under the NPT, particularly to the obligations to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in military doctrines and to pursue disarmaments. They also raise questions regarding the principle of good faith as recognized by the ICG. Finally, these decisions have been shaped in near total opacity with a small circles around the presidents without meaningful democratic debates. And next month, the Parliament is going to vote a new military programming law to increase the deterrence budget. So we expect it to go from 7 to 8 or 8.5 billions for the next 10 or 15 years, probably. This will provide an opportunity to our campaign to question the government on these various issues. Members of Parliament, with our support, have already begun submitting questions regarding the consistency of the President's statement with the NPT. And another part, and I think it will be a big part of the jobs, will be to meet and engage again and again with the media to explain these various issues I just read. So I will stop here and I will be happy to answer to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Marie. Very, very nice to hear your take on the Macron speech, particularly. Next, I want to turn to Carlos Umania. I think I don't know, not sure what your title is at the moment, Carlos, coordinator of the Alianza por el Desarme Nuclear, leader of the Spanish group, of the alliance of Spanish groups that work for nuclear disarmament. Over to you, Carlos.
Yeah, thanks. I'm actually not the coordinator. I'm the chair of the board. We have a coordinator. We're moving from a volunteer based group towards a secretariat, so that might change shortly. I'm going to share a presentation I made, a very small presentation. Let's see. So yeah, can we all see it? Yes.
Great.
So this is the Spanish Alliance for Nuclear Disarmament, or La Alianza por el Desarme Nuclear, is a coalition of now 65 organizations that is nationwide. And we were born in 2022. And of course, our goal is to raise awareness about the nuclear weapons issue and to get support for the TPNW from the government of Spain. We've done a lot. The Alliance works very, very well. We have a working group and also a board. And yes. So basically, to talk to you a little bit about what we've done, so far we've had 130 cities that have joined the ICAN Cities Appeal. Well, officially it's 128, but 2 more joined this week. Now, this QR code is very important. It's not associated to the ICAN Cities Appeal, and it's the real reason why I'm actually using a PowerPoint presentation, not just because I'm having a bad hair day. So if you can take out your phones and yeah, scan it, that would be great. There's also something very significant going on after a very successful visit from Nihon Hidankyo last year. This guy over here is a parliamentarian. He proposed a non-legislative proposal to vote for the TPNW in the Spanish Congress of Deputies. That has not been debated yet, thankfully, because we need to organize the lobbying efforts. But lately it's not looking so bad, and I'm going to tell you why. In February 14th of this year, in the Munich conference, Pedro Sanchez actually gave a very brilliant speech that was in defense of multilateralism, against nuclear rearmament, and also very significantly against nuclear deterrence. He said nuclear deterrence is far too costly and risky way of avoiding conflict between nations. And he also said that a system that requires zero mistakes and a constant correction to avoid total destruction is not a guarantee, it is a gamble. Now, he said that in the Munich conference, which is very significant because nuclear deterrence in this conference is seen as an unquestionable pillar of security. And he has not backed down from this position. So we see this definitely as an opportunity, because if he's rejecting deterrence, that really closes the gap between that and supporting the TPNW. So the Alliance, we also created this movement called Generation Zero Nukes. It's not only Spanish, it's mostly Spanish for the moment, but it's a way to get people, not just organizations, but people on board with our movement in a bit more of a flexible way. But it's also aims to have a broader, more global vision. And that's what the QR is for. This is a petition of no to war, so that we want the rest of Europe to take on the position that Spain has taken. And we want Europe to defend international law and to be a bastion also for diplomacy, because especially for the Iran war, the current actors, especially Israel and the United States, have lost all credibility regarding diplomacy. So this war has to end in a diplomatic solution, and we're asking Europe to step up for that. Something very significant happened last week. There was a survey, a poll, in which 79% of Spaniards sees that a nuclear war is possible, and that generated a lot of media attention to our cause. We've been super busy in large media, and we've in the large media nationwide, we've been able to talk about the link between Sanchez's position, the government's position, and the TPNW, and direct people towards the petition, and it's still generating a lot of echo. So yes, I'm going to end with that. Please check out our movement and sign our petition if you have not already done so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. This is great to hear. Also, that we shouldn't forget that, while many European countries are talking in a favorable way of nuclear weapons, there is also, as on so many other things, there's never unity on these positions. And Spain is maybe at the moment a great example where the political position at the highest level actually differs. As the last speaker, I'm turning to Clara, who works for the Swedish Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, SLMK in the Swedish acronym. And like Finland, Sweden has also joined NATO following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And now that discussion around nuclear weapons also has taken off. Clara, over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm very glad to be here. I wish I could be as positive as Carlos, but it's a little bit more depressing here in Sweden. But I also think that there's been more media coverage about Sweden and nuclear weapons in Europe than it's actually been in Sweden. So because of that, I think it's important to give a little background. So over the past few years, Sweden's position has changed dramatically. After the Second World War, Sweden secretly developed its own nuclear weapons program. However, when this became public, the criticism was overwhelming, and not least from civil society and the Federation of Social Democratic Women in Sweden. So when Sweden joined the NPT in 1968, the program was shut down, and so was also the discussion on Swedish nuclear weapons. And from that point on, Sweden focused on diplomacy. So regardless of which government was in power, the long-term goal remained the same, a world free of nuclear weapons. And different governments had different priorities, but the direction was always consistent. Well, in fact, the last conservative government that we had, we also have a conservative government now, but the last one openly criticized the presence of tactical nuclear weapons in Europe and argued that they should be dismantled. So fast forward to today. At a seminar a couple of years ago, NATO Director of Nuclear Policy, Jim Stokes, said that he was surprised by the lack of knowledge in Sweden among parliamentarians, government, and the general public about NATO and NATO's nuclear weapons. But from a Swedish perspective, this is not surprising, because in 2022, when Sweden applied for NATO membership, it was without a broad democratic process and a very limited public information about what a membership would actually mean, and particularly in relation to nuclear weapons. At the same time, critical voices were marginalized, and the government funding for civil society or civil society organizations that worked with peace and disarmament was withdrawn. So our ability to do our job, to hold those in power accountable, to mobilize society and shape public opinion has been very limited the last couple of years. When Sweden joined NATO, it was stated that both in official documents and in the public discourse that a membership would not affect Sweden's ability to promote its core foreign and security policy values, including nuclear disarmament. But in practice, it has. So nuclear disarmament is no longer a priority for Sweden. We've seen it both in the UN and in the Swedish policy and in debates. And in the parliament, or in debates in the parliament and in just a policy document, I think it is, the government has stated that, like other Nordic countries, Sweden sees no reason to host nuclear weapon on its territory in peacetime. But no reason is a very vague language. And increasingly, this is clear that the government does not treat this position as a firm commitment. So despite criticism from civil society, meetings with parliamentarians, op-eds, demonstrations, and petitions, the parliament has refused to pass legislation explicitly banning nuclear weapons on Swedish territory. But more recently, the debate has intensified. Discussions are now taking place about how and even which nuclear weapons that should protect Sweden or protect. Ideas that were once unthinkable are now being openly discussed, including restarting a Swedish nuclear weapons program, a Nordic nuclear weapon program, and the possibility of extending France nuclear deterrence over Europe. So both our Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense have stated that in times of war, they will be open to hosting nuclear weapons on Swedish soil. And the Nationalist Party, the second biggest party, that is, goes even further. But no one talks about the consequences of what this means. And our Prime Minister stated in a pre-recorded video that Sweden is part of this French nuclear talks, and there were no follow-up questions. So not so democratic, I would say. But following this, a public debate has emerged, and the Prime Minister claims that there have been constructive discussions with the Social Democratic leadership, while they maintain that no consensus has been reached. Now, the argument against the Social Democrat is that they are not fit to lead Sweden. But the only thing that the Social Democrat has emphasized is that nuclear weapons must not be deployed in Sweden, and that there are enough nuclear weapons in the world as it is. So when nuclear weapons are now seen as a protection here in Sweden, and that if you criticize it, you are weak. So as a civil society, we are trying to respond to this. We have reached out to media, but we received little to no response. We have encouraged our members to write local op-eds, organize the webinar about nuclear deterrence, have talking points, arguments, and requested meetings with government representatives, but so far without success. We have an election this fall, so we have sent out a survey to all political parties in the parliament ahead and ask about questions about nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. So we'll see how that goes. And we will continue to engage with individual parliamentarians and providing background materials and analysis and so on. But it's not easy when the democratic space is shrinking. But yeah, we do what we can. Thank you. That's